Hi, I'm Kevin, and this video is going to be an overview of my work on the default final project for CS224n. So we're looking at the SQuAD challenge in this study, which asks if you have a context paragraph and a question about that context paragraph. We want to figure out an answer to the question and where that answer is located inside the context paragraph. So what are some challenges behind this problem? One is natural language comprehension. Our model has to understand natural language to some degree. Another one is that it has to be robust enough to handle the differences between the context and query, which can sometimes be challenging. So some prior art in this area, we look at two existing architectures. One is bidirectional attention flow and the other is RNet. So recent advances in this area have centered around this idea of attention, where a model weighs different parts of a sentence more or less important when determining an answer. For our data sets, we have the usual train and dev contexts, questions, and answers, and we also have pre-trained word and character vectors built from the SQuAD dataset. So we did a bit of analysis into the data sets, and we looked at how many words were in the context and questions, and also the lengths of those words. So we found that by capping these words, we could prevent our model from overfitting and pick better hyperparameters for a final model. We also looked at how many types of questions there were, and we broadly categorized them into 6 types with the usual keywords. And we found that what accounts for many of the questions, actually. So for our methodology, we replicate the BiDAF architecture, and we also experiment with adding self-attention right below the bidirectional attention flow layer. So here's our TensorBoard graph, but let's break it down. The first one is word and character embedding layers, where we start with a token in the top right, and we break it down to letters to form character embeddings, and we pass these character embeddings to a CNN, max pool them, and produce character level embeddings. We also produce word level embeddings and concatenate them together to produce a final token embedding. Note that we differ from the original paper, that we don't apply an additional highway network because we found that negatively impacted performance. Next is our contextual embedding, which models temporal interactions, and we accomplish this by using a bidirectional RNN. The original paper uses LSTM cells, we use GRU cells, found that it's faster to train and it doesn't really impact performance, and this produces a contextual embedding. So here's the interesting part for our bidirectional attention flow layer. Context to query signifies which query words are most relevant for each context word, and the corresponding query to context figures out which context words are most similar to each query word, and are thus important for answering the question. So these two attention flow types produce the output to the bidirectional attention flow layer, which is an encoding of the query-aware representation to context words. We also experiment with adding a self-attention layer, but this was later removed. This was put right below the bidirectional attention layer, in which each context attention attends to all the other context attentions, and this gives us a high-level overview of which context words are actually important in answering the question. So for our modeling layer, we take the attention output, and then just like in the contextual embedding layer, we pass it through a bidirectional RNN to model temporal interactions. However, this is different from the contextual embedding in that we're capturing the interaction between query-aware words this time. This produces an output that's fed into the output layer, and we use the usual combining them using a dense layer, taking the softmax, produce a start index, and we pass the output from the first dense layer into an RNN, and again take a softmax to produce the end index. We subject these to the constraints that the end index is within 15 words of the start index, and the end index has to come after the start index. So for our results, we look at removing different parts of our model and looking at the EM and F1 scores. So we found that adding self-attention right below the bidirectional attention flow layer greatly negatively impacted performance, and this is likely due to the fact that we didn't implement the rest of the RNet architecture. But we also found other interesting things, like removing bidirectional attention doesn't actually impact the model as much as removing modeling layer or even the character CNN, which is greatly surprising. And just to be clear, removing parts of this model means swapping them out with a baseline model. So maybe the baseline's attention was better than we thought. So for our SQuAD test set scores, our model performs pretty well, not quite as well as the original white papers, but enough to be 10th highest on the leaderboards for F1 and 7th highest for EM, which is what we were optimizing for. So we found that our model overfits quite a bit, even though we apply extensive dropout regularization. We found that the train score is consistently about 20% higher than our dev score. Figure that if we fix our overfitting problem, our model might perform a little bit better. And this leads us into our discussion where we look at our accuracy on each of the question types. We find that it's roughly the same across the board. We do best on what and who questions, which are more objective than the ones we perform poorly on, which are how and why questions. We also briefly categorize all our incorrect outputs. One of these is incorrect attention, where our model attends to different parts of the context, but incorrectly. So we see here that Baltimore Ravens is a team just like the Broncos, but our model chooses the wrong one to attend to. A different one is incorrect answer span boundaries, where the correct answer is number 24 and our model outputs 24. Third one is a little bit trickier, but this is an ambiguous answer, where the correct answer is actually could be either of these, but our model picks the latter while the correct answer is the former. And it's difficult to tell which one is the correct one. So for future work, we weren't able to fully replicate either paper's results, and we suspect that this is due to not choosing the correct hyperparameters. So perhaps a more exhaustive hyperparameter search, which, while expensive, would ultimately produce better results. Another thing is that our implementations could be incorrect, just like us trying to apply the self-attention to our model without fully understanding the ramifications of its location in the RNet architecture could have led to a greatly decreased performance. So I'd like to acknowledge the CS224n staff for making this a great semester, and also Microsoft Azure team for providing us with the credits to run our model on. And here are our final set of references.